Get down on your knees. The officer's bark echoed through the crowded school gymnasium, silencing the chatter of students and parents gathered for the community event. All eyes turned to the front of the room, where a young black girl stood frozen, her hands gripping the edges of a trophy she'd just been awarded for academic excellence. The moment that should have been hers to celebrate was now twisted into something surreal and horrifying. Did you hear me? Get down, now. His voice was sharp, filled with authority he was abusing in full view of an audience too stunned to intervene. She hesitated, her eyes darting across the room in search of her father, but he was too far back, weaving his way through the crowd, his face a mask of controlled fury. What is going on? Her father's voice boomed, but the officer raised a hand to silence him, dismissing his authority without a second thought. This girl fits the description of a suspect we've been looking for, the officer declared loudly, his words cutting like knives. Braids, dark skin, carrying something suspicious. Can't be too careful, can we? He smirked, clearly enjoying the spectacle he was creating. Gasps rippled through the audience, but no one dared step forward. Not the teachers. Not the principal. Not even the parents. Everyone stood, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of what they were witnessing. This is ridiculous. Her father stepped forward, his hand outstretched protectively. But before he could reach her, the officer pulled a razor from his pocket. The collective gasp that followed was deafening. Suspects shouldn't have ways to disguise their appearance, the officer sneered. It's a precaution. He grabbed her arm, forcing her into a folding chair. Her protests were swallowed by the loud buzzing of the razor as it came to life. The sound filled the room, drowning out her sobs, her father's shouts, and the murmurs of shock from the crowd. You can't do this. I'm her father, and you're way out of line, her father bellowed, his voice cracking under the weight of his rage and helplessness. But the officer ignored him, running the razor over her scalp with brutal precision. Maybe this will teach her to respect authority, he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. As clumps of her hair fell to the floor, tears streamed down her face. The crowd began to stir uneasily. Whispers of, "This isn't right," and, "Someone needs to stop him," filled the air, but no one dared to step forward. They all feared the repercussions, the power of a badge, and the consequences of defiance. When it was over, the officer stood back, his work done. Now she looks like someone who has nothing to hide, he said, laughing as he tossed the razor onto the table beside him. The room was silent, save for her soft, heart-wrenching sobs as her father knelt beside her, cradling her shorn head in his hands. The officer turned to leave, his swagger unbroken. But before he could step out of the gym, her father rose to his feet. His face was a portrait of fury and resolve. "You have no idea who I am," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a storm about to break. The officer laughed dismissively. "I don't care who you are. People like you don't scare me." The words hung in the air like a dare, but the man's eyes told a different story. The look he gave the officer wasn't one of fear. It was the calm before a reckoning. The room buzzed with a new kind of energy, curiosity mixed with dread. Whispers spread like wildfire. Who was this man? Why did the officer suddenly seem less sure of himself? As the officer disappeared from view, the father knelt beside his daughter again, his hands trembling as he promised her softly, "This isn't over." Not even close. The stage was set for a confrontation no one could have predicted. What the officer didn't know was that this wasn't just any father. He was a man with the power to turn the tables, and he would stop at nothing to ensure justice was served. But what could one man do against a system designed to protect people like the officer? And how far was he willing to go to make him pay? Stay with us as we unravel a story of humiliation, power, and the pursuit of justice that will leave you speechless. The ending is one you won't see coming. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To our black viewers, your voice matters, your story matters, and your fight matters. This space is here to uplift and inspire, showing that justice can prevail, even in the face of injustice. If you're ready for a story that champions resilience, justice, and redemption, make sure to hit the subscribe button and join our community. Now, sit back and enjoy a tale that will leave you inspired. Let's get started. The gymnasium smelled faintly of fresh wax, the polished floors reflecting the overhead lights like a mirror. It was a Saturday morning, and families had gathered for the community's annual Academic Achievement Award ceremony. Parents chatted among themselves, their voices mingling with the rustling of papers and the occasional squeal of sneakers on the floor. On the stage, a row of chairs awaited the students who would soon be called up to accept their honors. Brianna Johnson, 15, sat among her classmates in the front row, her fingers nervously smoothing the skirt of her school uniform. She glanced down at the program in her hands, her name printed neatly next to Outstanding Academic Excellence Award. This was her moment, and she was determined to make her father proud. Brianna was a bright, driven teenager who balanced a rigorous academic schedule with after-school tutoring for younger students at the local community center. Her passion for learning was evident in everything she did, from her meticulous notes to the way she lit up during classroom debates. But it wasn't just her intelligence that made her special. Brianna had an unwavering kindness, a belief in fairness, and an infectious optimism that drew people to her. Her father, Marcus Johnson, watched her from the back of the gymnasium. Dressed sharply in a tailored suit, Marcus exuded a quiet authority. At 42, he was a man of conviction, a federal judge known for his integrity and dedication to justice. He was deeply proud of his daughter and the young woman she was becoming. Her mother's absence, they had lost her to cancer years ago, only strengthened their bond. He had raised Brianna alone, instilling in her the values of hard work, resilience, and compassion. Next up, the award for Outstanding Academic Excellence, the principal announced, her voice echoing through the sound system. This year's recipient is someone who has consistently gone above and beyond in their studies and has shown exceptional leadership among their peers. Please welcome Brianna Johnson to the stage. Applause erupted as Brianna rose from her seat, her face lighting up with a mix of pride and nerves. She made her way to the stage, her father clapping enthusiastically from the back. But as she stepped up to accept her award, a sudden commotion drew everyone's attention to the doors at the far end of the gym. Officer James Wallace strode in, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. Tall and broad-shouldered, Wallace carried himself with an air of authority that demanded attention. His crisp uniform and polished badge shone under the fluorescent lights. To most in the room, he was just another police officer, but to Marcus, he was a symbol of a system that often wielded power carelessly. Wallace had been assigned to the area for years, known for his aggressive demeanor and a tendency to escalate even the smallest confrontations. He justified his behavior as doing his job, but for many, especially the black families in the community, his presence was a source of unease. "Excuse me," Wallace said loudly, his voice cutting through the applause. The principal, caught off guard, stopped mid-sentence, the microphone lowering in her hand. "What is this about?" she asked, her confusion mirrored in the murmur spreading through the audience. Wallace ignored her, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Brianna. He marched toward the stage, his expression hard and unyielding. Brianna froze, the trophy clutched tightly in her hands. "Sir, this is a school event," Marcus called from the back, his voice firm but controlled as he began moving through the crowd. Wallace's lips curled into a smirk as he glanced briefly at Marcus before turning back to Brianna. "We received a report about someone matching her description involved in a recent incident," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Gasps rippled through the room, and Brianna's face flushed with confusion and fear. "What? I didn't do anything," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the growing tension. "Let's not make a scene," Wallace said, though it was clear he had no intention of avoiding one. He stepped onto the stage, looming over Brianna. "I need to check something. Just a precaution. This is outrageous." Marcus shouted, his pace quickening as he pushed through the rows of chairs. You can't just barge in here and humiliate my daughter without cause. Wallace didn't flinch. I'm just doing my job, sir. If she's innocent, she has nothing to worry about. Brianna's hands trembled as Wallace pulled out a razor from his pocket. The crowd collectively recoiled, whispers of disbelief spreading like wildfire. This is not how you handle this. Marcus's voice cracked as he reached the stage, but Wallace held up a hand to stop him. Back off, Wallace said coldly. I'm in charge here. The room fell into a stunned silence as Wallace gestured for Brianna to sit in a chair. When she hesitated, he gripped her arm, forcing her down. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked at her father, who was now restrained by another officer who had arrived unnoticed. This is what happens when people think they're above the rules, Wallace said, his voice dripping with condescension as he brought the razor to her hair. The first buzz of the blade was deafening, slicing through the air and Brianna's sense of safety all at once. Marcus's cries of protest filled the room, but Wallace continued, his smirk unwavering. As clumps of Brianna's hair fell to the floor, the crowd remained frozen, their shock rendering them silent witnesses to the humiliation unfolding before them. When it was over, Wallace stepped back, tossing the razor onto the floor beside the chair. Now she won't be hiding anything, he said, his tone casual, as if he hadn't just shattered a young girl's dignity in front of her entire community. Marcus knelt beside Brianna, his hands trembling as he tried to comfort her. The room was heavy with silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on everyone present. Wallace turned to leave, his swagger undiminished. But as he reached the doors, Marcus's voice cut through the silence. You don't know who you're dealing with, he said, his tone low and steady, carrying a promise that Wallace was too arrogant to recognize. The crowd began to murmur again, their whispers filled with questions and unease. Who was Marcus Johnson, and why was his quiet fury more unsettling than the officer's brazen actions? The air was charged with an unspoken tension, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The air in the Johnson household was heavy that evening, a silence hanging over the rooms like an oppressive fog. Brianna sat at the dining table, her head bowed low as she avoided the reflective surface of her plate. The once vibrant energy in her presence had been stripped away, leaving her quiet and withdrawn. Her father, Marcus, leaned against the kitchen counter, his fingers clutching a steaming mug of coffee he hadn't touched. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, Marcus finally said, his voice cracking as he broke the silence. He placed the mug down and approached her cautiously, as though afraid his own presence might hurt her further. Brianna didn't look up, her eyes fixated on her lap. It doesn't matter. He got what he wanted, didn't he? Everyone saw me like that. Humiliated. Powerless. Marcus felt his chest tighten. The weight of his failure to protect her was unbearable. As a judge, he had dedicated his life to justice, to the rule of law, and yet, in the most critical moment, he had been rendered utterly powerless. It does matter, he said, his voice firm despite the lump in his throat. What he did to you wasn't just wrong, it was criminal. And I will make sure he's held accountable. How? She whispered, her voice barely audible. He's a cop. They always get away with it. Marcus felt the sting of her words, the truth they carried. But he refused to let her despair become their reality. He knelt beside her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. Not this time, Brianna. I promise you. Not this time. Brianna finally lifted her gaze, her tear-streaked face meeting his. There was pain in her eyes, but also a flicker of hope, a small glimmer that her father would find a way to make things right. Marcus rose, his resolve hardening as he left the room. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. His chambers were quiet, the air filled with the faint scent of leather and paper. He pulled out a folder and began reviewing every legal precedent and statute he could find on police misconduct. His focus was intense, his mind racing with strategies to ensure that Wallace couldn't escape accountability. A knock on the door broke his concentration. He looked up to see his colleague, Judge Evelyn Harris, standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression both curious and concerned. "Marcus, I heard about what happened at the school," she said softly as she stepped inside. "Are you okay?" "No," Marcus admitted, gesturing for her to take a seat. "But this isn't about me. It's about Brianna and making sure Wallace faces consequences." Evelyn sat down, her brow furrowing. "You know how these cases go. It's not easy to hold an officer accountable, especially someone like Wallace. He's been protected by the system for years." "That's exactly why I can't let this go," Marcus replied, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "If I don't fight for her, for every kid who's been mistreated by someone like him, then what am I even doing here?" Evelyn studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'll help you," she said simply. "Whatever you need." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude but knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be treacherous, and Wallace wasn't the type to back down easily. Later that day, Marcus attended a town hall meeting where several community members had gathered to discuss local issues. The atmosphere was tense, the recent incident at the school casting a shadow over the proceedings. As Marcus stepped up to the microphone, the room quieted, all eyes on him. "My name is Marcus Johnson," he began, his voice steady and commanding. "Many of you know me as a judge, but tonight I'm here as a father. What happened to my daughter at the school was not just an attack on her dignity but an attack on this community. It's a reminder of the power imbalance we face every day. And it's time we did something about it." The room erupted in murmurs, some nodding in agreement while others exchanged skeptical glances. One man, seated near the back, raised his hand. "Judge Johnson, with all due respect, what can you do? Officers like Wallace have been terrorizing us for years, and nothing ever changes." Marcus met the man's gaze, his jaw tightening. "It changes now. But I can't do it alone. We need to stand together, to demand accountability and justice." As the meeting continued, Marcus felt the support of the room slowly shift in his favor. People shared their stories of encounters with Wallace and other officers who had abused their power. The collective outrage was palpable, a fire that Marcus knew he had to keep burning. Meanwhile, Wallace was growing increasingly agitated. Word of Marcus's speech and the growing community support had reached him, and he didn't like what he was hearing. Seated in the local precinct's break room, he leaned back in his chair, scowling as he listened to a news report about the incident. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered, turning to his partner, Officer Greg Martin. "Johnson's making a spectacle of this." "Maybe you should back off," Greg suggested cautiously. "The guy's a federal judge. He's not someone you want to mess with." Wallace scoffed. "He's just another loudmouth trying to make a name for himself. He doesn't scare me." But deep down, Wallace felt a flicker of unease. He knew Marcus wasn't like the others who had tried and failed to challenge him. There was a determination in Marcus's eyes that he couldn't ignore. As days turned into weeks, the tension between Marcus and Wallace continued to build. Marcus filed formal complaints, launched independent investigations, and worked tirelessly to gather evidence against Wallace. The case began to gain traction, drawing media attention and putting pressure on the precinct to respond. One evening, as Marcus sat at his desk reviewing case files, he received a call from an anonymous tipster. The voice on the other end was shaky but firm. "I've got something you need to see," the caller said. "Meet me at the old factory on Lincoln Street tonight." Marcus hesitated, the weight of the decision heavy on his mind. But his resolve was unwavering. He needed to uncover the truth, no matter the risk. As he prepared to leave, he glanced at a photo of Brianna on his desk, her smile a reminder of why he was fighting so hard. The meeting at the factory was tense, the dimly lit space amplifying the gravity of the moment. The tipster handed Marcus a folder filled with documents and photos, evidence of Wallace's corruption and abuse of power spanning years. As Marcus flipped through the pages, his anger grew, but so did his determination. "This changes everything," he muttered to himself, his mind racing with possibilities. Back at home, Brianna was beginning to regain her confidence. Encouraged by her father's determination, she started speaking out about her experience, sharing her story with others and finding strength in the support of her community. Her voice became a rallying cry for justice, a symbol of resilience that inspired those around her. As the walls began to close in on Wallace, his arrogance started to crack. The whispers of an impending reckoning grew louder, and the once untouchable officer found himself facing a force he hadn't anticipated, the unyielding determination of a father who refused to let his daughter's dignity be stolen without a fight. What Marcus didn't know was that his pursuit of justice would lead to a confrontation that would shake the entire community to its core. The stage was set, and the battle between right and wrong was about to reach its boiling point. The question now was, who would come out on top? The courthouse was packed. Rows of seats were filled with community members, reporters, and a handful of Marcus's colleagues, all drawn by the high-profile nature of the case. Outside, a group of protesters held signs demanding justice for Brianna, their chants echoing faintly through the thick courthouse walls. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture composed but his focus razor-sharp. This moment had been weeks in the making, and every detail had to be perfect. Across the room, Wallace sat with his attorney, his usual arrogance now tempered by unease. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his jaw tightening every time Marcus glanced in his direction. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Evelyn Harris entered, her black robes swaying as she took her seat at the bench. She gave Marcus a brief, encouraging nod before addressing the court. "Let's proceed," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority necessary to manage a case so emotionally charged. Marcus stood, his confidence evident in the deliberate way he moved. "Your Honor, the evidence I present today will prove not only that Officer Wallace abused his authority but that his actions are part of a larger pattern of misconduct that has gone unchecked for far too long." As he spoke, Brianna sat quietly in the gallery, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She was nervous, but also proud of her father. He had promised her justice, and now, he was delivering. The first piece of evidence Marcus presented was a video. Captured by a teacher at the school gym, it showed Wallace forcing Brianna into the chair and shaving her hair. The courtroom was silent as the video played, the sound of the razor and Brianna's muffled sobs filling the air. Several people in the audience gasped, while others shook their heads in disbelief. Wallace's attorney tried to object, but Judge Harris silenced him with a single look. Marcus paused the video. "This isn't just an abuse of power," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "It's an act of humiliation. It's an act of hate." He turned toward the jury, meeting their eyes one by one. "This is not an isolated incident. Officer Wallace has a history, a long history, of targeting and mistreating individuals based on nothing more than the color of their skin." Marcus then presented a series of witness testimonies, each recounting encounters with Wallace that painted a damning picture. A young man described being harassed during a routine traffic stop. An elderly woman spoke about Wallace threatening her son without cause. Each story built on the last, creating an undeniable pattern of abuse. As the testimonies unfolded, Wallace's confidence began to crack. He leaned over to whisper to his attorney, but his words were drowned out by the weight of the evidence mounting against him. When it was finally Wallace's turn to take the stand, the tension in the room was palpable. He straightened his uniform and walked to the witness stand, his expression a mix of defiance and thinly veiled anxiety. Marcus approached him slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Wallace, you've stated in your report that you believe my daughter was a suspect in a crime. Is that correct?" "Yes," Wallace replied, his voice clipped. "And what evidence did you have to support that belief?" "She matched the description," Wallace said flatly. "Braids, dark skin. Carrying something suspicious." Marcus's lips tightened. Braids and dark skin. That's all it took for you to decide she was guilty. Wallace shifted in his seat. It wasn't just that. She was acting nervous. She was nervous because you humiliated her in front of her classmates, Marcus interrupted, his voice rising slightly. Did you have any other evidence? A specific identification? Witnesses? Wallace hesitated. No, he admitted reluctantly. Marcus took a step closer. So you acted purely on your own bias. On a stereotype. And in doing so, you stripped my daughter of her dignity and her sense of safety. Wallace's attorney tried to object, but Judge Harris waved him off. Answer the question, Officer Wallace, she said sternly. I did what I thought was necessary, Wallace said, his tone defensive. I was trying to maintain order. Order? Marcus repeated, his voice tinged with incredulity. By terrorizing a child? By shaving her hair in front of her peers? Tell me, Officer Wallace, was this about order, or was it about control? The courtroom was silent, the weight of Marcus's words hanging in the air. Wallace's mouth opened as if to respond, but no sound came out. Marcus turned to the jury. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every person who has been subjected to this kind of abuse. It's about a system that allows people like Officer Wallace to act without accountability. But today, that changes. As Marcus returned to his seat, the room erupted into murmurs. Wallace's composure was slipping, his confidence unraveling with each passing moment. Judge Harris called for closing arguments, and Marcus delivered a final, impassioned plea for justice. What happened to my daughter could have happened to anyone's child. And unless we stand up and demand better, it will keep happening. Today, you have the power to send a message, that no one is above the law. When the jury retired to deliberate, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Hours passed, each moment stretching into an eternity. Finally, the jury returned, their expressions somber but resolute. The foreman stood, clearing his throat before reading the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer James Wallace, guilty of misconduct, abuse of power, and violation of civil rights. The courtroom erupted into cheers and applause. Tears streamed down Brianna's face as she hugged her father tightly, her heart finally feeling a sense of relief. Marcus held her close, his own tears threatening to spill as he whispered, I told you, sweetheart. Justice always finds a way. As Wallace was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his once unshakable arrogance was gone, replaced by the hollow realization that his actions had finally caught up to him. The community had spoken, and the system that had protected him for so long was no longer his shield. Outside, the protesters cheered as news of the verdict spread. For Marcus and Brianna, it wasn't just a personal victory, it was a symbol of hope for a community that had long been denied justice. But deep down, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over. It never was. And yet, for the first time in a long time, it felt like a step in the right direction. The courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of the verdict still lingering in the air. Marcus remained seated, his hands resting on the table in front of him. He watched as Wallace was escorted out in handcuffs, his once confident stride now reduced to the slow, reluctant shuffle of a man who had finally been brought to his knees. Brianna stood nearby, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though trying to hold everything together. Her father turned to her, his expression softening as he rose from his seat. You did it, she said quietly, her voice trembling. You really did it. Marcus reached out, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. We did it, he corrected. Your courage, your willingness to speak out, made this possible. Her lips quivered as she tried to smile, but the overwhelming emotions made it impossible to hold back her tears. I didn't think it would ever feel over, she admitted, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. It's not completely over, Marcus said softly, guiding her toward the door. But today was a victory. And we'll take everyone we can get. As they stepped out of the courthouse, the cheers from the crowd outside grew louder. People waved signs and banners, their voices a mix of joy and defiance. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and community members surged forward to thank Marcus and Brianna for their fight. Amid the chaos, a young woman approached Brianna, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "What you went through, it gave me the courage to stand up for myself. I don't feel so alone anymore." Brianna blinked, surprised. I didn't think. I mean, it wasn't easy." "It never is," the woman replied. "But you showed us it's possible." Marcus watched the exchange, his chest swelling with pride. He could see the impact Brianna's story had already made, the ripple effect spreading through the community. It was a reminder that the fight for justice wasn't just about one case or one family, it was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or dehumanized. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus and Brianna made their way to the car. The silence between them was comfortable, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just happened. But as Marcus started the engine, Brianna turned to him, her brow furrowed. "What happens now?" she asked. "To Wallace, I mean." Marcus sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "He'll face sentencing in a few weeks. Depending on the charges, he could serve time. But the real victory is that he's off the force. He can't hurt anyone else." Brianna nodded, her gaze distant. "Do you think he regrets it? What he did?" Marcus hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I don't know, sweetheart. Some people learn from their mistakes. Others, they just blame the world for their downfall." She looked out the window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her seatbelt. "I want to believe people can change," she said quietly. "Even someone like him." Marcus glanced at her, his heart aching at her capacity for empathy even after everything she had endured. "You have a good heart, Brianna. Don't ever lose that." The days that followed were a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and community events. Marcus and Brianna became the faces of a movement, their story resonating far beyond the boundaries of their town. Donations poured in to support legal reforms, and Marcus was invited to speak at forums and panels about the systemic issues that had allowed officers like Wallace to operate unchecked. But not everyone was supportive. Threatening messages appeared in Marcus's inbox, and anonymous calls to their house left Brianna shaken. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the phone rang again. Marcus let out a frustrated sigh, reaching for it. "You've made a lot of enemies," a gruff voice said on the other end. "You should know when to back off." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "Just someone trying to give you some advice," the voice replied, before the line went dead. Brianna watched him closely, her eyes wide with concern. Was it another threat? Marcus nodded, setting the phone down. "But we're not backing down. Fear is how they win. We're not giving them that power." Later that night, Marcus sat alone in his study, surrounded by stacks of papers and files. He stared at the photo of his late wife on his desk, her kind eyes seeming to encourage him even in her absence. "I wish you were here," he murmured. "You'd know what to say, how to make this easier." A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Brianna stepped inside, her hair tied back in a way that reminded him of her mother. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus gestured for her to sit, and she curled up in the armchair across from him. "Dad," she began hesitantly, "do you ever think about giving up? Not fighting so hard?" He leaned back in his chair, considering her question. "I'd be lying if I said no," he admitted. "There are moments when it feels like the weight of the world is on my shoulders. But then I remember why I started. I think about you. About the future I want for you. And giving up stops being an option." Brianna nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to be brave like you. You already are, Marcus said, his voice filled with pride. You've been brave every step of the way. The bond between them deepened in that quiet moment, their shared determination serving as a reminder that they were in this together. Meanwhile, Wallace sat in his holding cell, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the floor. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in, the walls closing in on him in more ways than one. The guards treated him with thinly veiled disdain, their eyes cold as they escorted him to and from the courtroom. The men he once considered allies now kept their distance, unwilling to associate with someone who had become a liability. For the first time, Wallace felt the sting of isolation. He had always believed himself untouchable, his badge a shield against accountability. But now, stripped of his authority and facing the consequences of his actions, he was forced to confront the man he had become. The night was long and sleepless for everyone involved, the echoes of the day's events reverberating through their minds. As the city settled into an uneasy calm, the stage was set for the final chapter, a reckoning that would reveal whether justice could truly prevail or whether the scars of the past would linger, demanding more than one victory to heal. The courthouse halls were quieter now, the rush of the trial giving way to a more subdued tension. Marcus sat at his desk late that night, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the stacks of legal documents that had become his constant companions. Outside, the city lights flickered, but the world felt still for the first time in weeks. Brianna walked in, her steps hesitant. She held a cup of tea in her hands, its steam curling into the air. "You've been in here all night," she said softly, setting the cup down on his desk. Marcus looked up, exhaustion evident in his eyes but accompanied by a flicker of gratitude. "I just needed to think," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Today felt like a victory, but the fight isn't over. There are still so many questions, so many things left to do." Brianna hesitated, her fingers trailing along the edge of the desk. "Do you ever wonder if this is enough? I mean, Wallace is guilty. Everyone knows what he did. Isn't that the point? Why does it feel like it's not finished?" Marcus sighed, his hand brushing over the bridge of his nose. "Because it's not just about Wallace," he admitted. "He's one man in a system that let him thrive. This isn't just about making sure he pays for what he did, it's about making sure no one else gets away with it again." Brianna sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think people will listen? I mean, really listen? It feels like they care for now, but what happens when the next big story comes along?" Her question hit him harder than he expected. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But if we don't keep pushing, if we don't keep this in the spotlight, then the moment will pass. And everything we've done will be for nothing." Brianna nodded, her brow furrowing. "I hate that it has to be like this. That it takes so much just to get people to care." "It shouldn't be this hard," Marcus agreed, his voice quiet but firm. "But sometimes the only way to make change is to make noise. To force people to look, even when they don't want to." The weight of his words settled between them, but before either could speak again, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "Another message," he muttered, setting the phone down without reading it. "More threats?" Brianna asked, her voice tinged with worry. Marcus nodded. "It's not surprising. People don't like it when you challenge the status quo. But we're not stopping." Brianna's hand brushed against his, her touch steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We'll face it together," she said quietly. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings and interviews. Marcus found himself juggling the demands of his judicial duties with the growing responsibilities of being a public figure in the fight for justice. Each appearance brought new support but also new challenges. The threats continued, some subtle, others explicit. One afternoon, Marcus met with a coalition of community leaders who had rallied around his cause. They gathered in a modest conference room, their faces a mix of determination and weariness. "We need to push for policy changes," one woman said, her tone urgent. Wallace isn't the only one. There are others like him, and we need to make sure they're held accountable. I agree, Marcus replied, his voice steady. But policy changes take time. We need to focus on what we can do now, building trust in the community, encouraging others to come forward with their stories. A man at the table frowned, his arms crossed. People are scared, Marcus. They've seen what happens when you challenge the system. Not everyone has your resources or your platform. Marcus leaned forward, his gaze intense. That's exactly why we have to do this. Because if we don't, who will? We can't let fear keep us silent. The room fell quiet, the weight of his words settling over the group. Slowly, one by one, they nodded in agreement. Meanwhile, Wallace's world continued to unravel. The public disgrace of his trial had stripped him of his badge, his reputation, and the carefully constructed facade of authority he had relied on for years. His family distanced themselves, his friends disappeared, and even his former colleagues avoided him. For the first time in his life, Wallace found himself alone. He sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, staring at the peeling wallpaper and the empty bottles scattered across the table. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. He had thought he was untouchable, that his actions would never catch up to him. Now, he was faced with the stark reality of his choices. A knock at the door startled him. He hesitated before opening it, his heart pounding. Standing there was Greg Martin, his former partner. "What do you want?" Wallace asked, his voice rough. Greg stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "I heard about the sentencing date," he said simply. "Figured you could use some company." Wallace scoffed, turning away. "You're a little late for that." Greg sighed, sitting down uninvited. "You've made a lot of enemies, James. But I didn't come here to lecture you. I came because I want to know, do you even understand what you did?" Wallace stiffened, his hands clenching into fists. "I was doing my job." "No," Greg said firmly. "You were abusing your power. And now you're paying the price for it. But instead of wallowing, maybe you should think about how you got here. About what you can do to fix it." Wallace didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he stared out the window. Greg shook his head, standing to leave. "Think about it, James. You're at rock bottom. The only way out is to take responsibility." As Greg left, Wallace remained frozen in place, his mind racing. For the first time, the cracks in his denial began to show. Back at home, Marcus and Brianna prepared for the next chapter of their journey. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Marcus knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and setbacks. But as he looked at his daughter, her resilience shining through even in the darkest moments, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "We've come this far," he said quietly. "And we're not stopping now." Brianna nodded, her expression determined. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The story wasn't over yet, but they were ready for whatever lay ahead. The fight for justice was a long one, but they knew they were on the right path. And together, they would keep moving forward. The evening air was cool and heavy with the scent of rain as Marcus and Brianna sat in their living room. The hum of the television provided a faint backdrop to their conversation, though neither of them was paying attention to the screen. A news segment recapped the case against Wallace, detailing the ripple effect it had caused in the community and beyond. "Every time I see his face, I feel. I don't know, like it's not enough," Brianna admitted, her voice soft but tinged with frustration. She sat curled up on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes fixed on the floor. Marcus nodded, his fingers steepled as he leaned forward in his chair. "It's a natural feeling," he said after a moment. "What he did to you, to so many others, no punishment will ever erase that. But accountability is a start." Brianna looked up, her gaze sharp. "Is it, though? What if he never really understands what he did?" What if this doesn't change anything? Marcus studied her, the pain in her voice cutting deeper than any of Wallace's threats. Change is slow, sweetheart. And frustrating. But the fact that he's been held accountable at all is a crack in the wall. One crack can lead to more, until the whole structure falls. Brianna's lips pressed together, her expression conflicted. I want him to feel what I felt. The fear. The humiliation. I want him to know what it's like. Marcus's heart ached at her words, her raw emotion a reminder of how deeply the experience had scarred her. He moved to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. I understand, he said quietly. And you're entitled to those feelings. But the greatest victory is not letting him control your life any longer. Taking back your power by moving forward. Her head rested against his shoulder, and for a moment, the room was silent except for the muted voices of the news anchor. Brianna's breathing slowed, her anger momentarily softened by her father's steady presence. The next day, Marcus met with Evelyn Harris in her chambers. She greeted him with a warm smile, though her expression quickly turned serious as they sat down. The sentencing is coming up, she began, her tone measured. Are you prepared for what that will bring? Marcus nodded, his face unreadable. I've been preparing since the day this started. But my focus now is on what comes next, ensuring this isn't just a single victory in an endless fight. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk. You've made significant strides, Marcus. The community is rallying, conversations are happening, and policies are being questioned. But you know as well as I do, the system doesn't change overnight. It doesn't, Marcus agreed. But I've seen what happens when people give up, when they accept the status quo because it's easier. I won't let that happen here. Evelyn studied him for a long moment before nodding. You're relentless, I'll give you that. But don't forget to take care of yourself in the process. You can't fight every battle alone. Marcus offered a small smile. I'm not alone. I've got Brianna, and I've got the community behind me. That's more than enough. Evelyn's eyes softened. Just promise me you'll take a moment to breathe. This fight is a marathon, not a sprint. Later that evening, as Marcus and Brianna prepared dinner together, the doorbell rang. Marcus opened the door to find Greg Martin standing on the porch, his hands shoved into his pockets. Greg, Marcus said, his tone cautious. What brings you here? Greg shifted uncomfortably. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I needed to talk to you. Marcus stepped aside, allowing him in. Brianna, he called, can you give us a moment? Brianna hesitated, glancing between the two men, before retreating to her room. What's on your mind? Marcus asked, his arms crossed as he leaned against the kitchen counter. Greg exhaled slowly. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. About Wallace, about the department, about my own role in all of this. Marcus's expression hardened slightly. And? I won't make excuses, Greg said quickly, holding up a hand. I knew Wallace had a reputation, and I didn't do enough to stop him. Maybe I thought it wasn't my place, or maybe I just didn't want to rock the boat. But I see now how wrong that was. Marcus's gaze didn't waver. It's easy to see that after the fact, Greg. What are you planning to do about it now? Greg swallowed, his shoulders sagging slightly. I want to help. I've already started documenting everything I know about Wallace's behavior, instances the department ignored or covered up. I'm willing to testify if it means exposing the larger problem. For a moment, Marcus said nothing, his eyes searching Greg's face for any sign of insincerity. Finally, he nodded. If you're serious about this, it could make a real difference. But know that once you start down this path, there's no turning back. The backlash will be intense. I'm ready, Greg said firmly. It's the least I can do. The two men shook hands, a tentative but meaningful gesture of solidarity. As Greg left, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps change was possible, even from the most unexpected places. That night, Brianna joined Marcus in the living room, her curiosity evident. "What did he want?" she asked. "He wants to help," Marcus replied simply. Brianna's brow furrowed. "Do you trust him?" "I don't know yet," Marcus admitted. "But sometimes, the people you least expect can surprise you. And if he's willing to put himself on the line, we'd be foolish not to give him the chance." Brianna nodded slowly, her mind turning over the possibilities. "Maybe people can change," she said quietly, more to herself than to her father. As the days passed, the community continued to rally, their voices growing louder in the face of resistance. Marcus and Brianna found themselves at the center of a movement larger than they had ever imagined. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, they faced it together, their bond stronger than ever. But the lingering question remained: would justice truly be enough to heal the wounds left behind? Or was the fight only just beginning? The courtroom was alive with anticipation on the day of Wallace's sentencing. The public gallery was packed with community members, activists, and reporters, their whispers blending into a low hum of expectation. Marcus sat beside Brianna in the front row, their presence a testament to the resilience and courage that had carried them through the storm. Judge Evelyn Harris entered, her expression calm but resolute as she took her seat. The room fell silent, every eye turning toward the front as Wallace was escorted in, his shackles clinking faintly in the stillness. He looked smaller now, his once imposing frame hunched under the weight of his circumstances. Evelyn's voice cut through the air, steady and deliberate. "Officer James Wallace, you have been found guilty of multiple counts of misconduct, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. Today's proceedings will determine your sentence." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his hand brushing against Brianna's. She glanced at him, her face a mixture of hope and lingering apprehension. Wallace's attorney stood, delivering a last-ditch plea for leniency. He cited Wallace's years of service, his family, and the supposed remorse he had shown. But the words rang hollow, and the courtroom's collective mood remained resolute. When the defense sat down, Evelyn turned her attention to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, as the father of the victim and a representative of this community, you have the right to speak before sentencing. Please come forward." Marcus rose, his movements deliberate as he approached the podium. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before speaking. "Your Honor, members of the court," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. "Today is not just about my daughter or my family. It's about every person who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or dehumanized by those who are supposed to protect us." He turned slightly, addressing the gallery as much as the bench. James Wallace used his badge as a weapon, not a shield. His actions were not mistakes, they were choices. Choices rooted in prejudice and a belief that he was untouchable. Marcus's gaze shifted to Wallace, who avoided his eyes. "I don't expect an apology from you, Officer Wallace. But I do hope that in the silence of your cell, you'll reflect on the lives you've affected, on the trust you've shattered. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find a way to become a better man." The courtroom remained silent as Marcus returned to his seat. Brianna reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. When Evelyn delivered the sentence, 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, a collective sigh of relief swept through the room. For many, it was a rare moment of justice, a crack in the armor of a system that too often shielded its abusers. Wallace's reaction was subdued. His head lowered as the guards escorted him out, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by quiet resignation. It was clear he understood the finality of what had happened, the life he had known slipping away. Outside the courthouse, Marcus and Brianna were greeted by a crowd of supporters. They held signs with messages of solidarity and hope, their cheers a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere inside. One woman approached Brianna, her eyes brimming with emotion. Thank you, she said, her voice shaking. You've given us hope. My daughter was afraid to speak out, but because of you, she's ready to tell her story. Brianna smiled, her expression warm but humble. It wasn't just me, she said. It was all of us. Together. For Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. He knew the fight wasn't over, but this moment, this win, was proof that change was possible. He felt a sense of pride in his daughter, in her strength and resilience, and in the community that had rallied around them. As the weeks turned into months, life slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy. Brianna returned to school, her confidence growing as she found her voice in advocacy. She joined local youth organizations, speaking at events and inspiring others to stand up for justice. Marcus continued his work as a judge, but with a renewed sense of purpose. He became an outspoken advocate for police reform, working with lawmakers and community leaders to push for systemic change. His courtroom became a symbol of accountability, a place where justice was pursued relentlessly and fairly. Even Greg Martin played a part in the aftermath, his testimony against Wallace sparking further investigations into the precinct. His decision to come forward earned him both respect and criticism, but he stood by his choice, determined to be part of the solution. As for Wallace, his time in prison was marked by introspection. Stripped of his power and surrounded by those he had once dismissed, he began to confront the man he had become. Letters from his estranged family and therapy sessions forced him to face the pain he had caused, and though redemption seemed distant, the seeds of accountability were planted. On a quiet evening months later, Marcus and Brianna sat on their porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the garden. Brianna sipped her lemonade, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you think we made a difference?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Marcus smiled, his eyes reflecting the fading light. "I know we did. And we'll keep making a difference, one step at a time." Brianna nodded, her expression resolute. "I want to keep fighting, Dad. For everyone who's still afraid to." He reached over, placing a hand on hers. "You have a gift, Brianna. Use it wisely, and you'll change the world." The journey hadn't been easy, and the scars of their experience would remain. But together, they had turned pain into purpose, injustice into action. And in doing so, they had found a strength that could not be broken. This story reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change is possible. It's a testament to the power of resilience, accountability, and the courage to speak out. What did this story make you feel? Did it inspire you, anger you, or maybe even give you hope? Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this story and want more powerful narratives, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join the Tales of Twist community. Let's keep these important conversations alive. Until next time.